Okay. You're here with Jack Quinn. I'm interviewing my father. So, Dad, why don't you give a little introduction about yourself?
My name is Bill Quinn. I am from Lexington. I've lived here most of my life. Uh, I went to elementary, middle school, and high school in Lexington. I also attended the University of Kentucky, from which I graduated with a computer science degree. And I married my wife, Michelle, right out of college and started a job right out of college. And after about 5 years, we had three sons who are named Wills Quinn, Jack Quinn, and Charlie Quinn.
Okay, so if you don't mind me asking, how old are you?
My age is 7 squared plus 1.
Okay, so around 50.
Yeah, plus or minus, yeah.
All right. What was your childhood like?
My childhood was pretty fun. I grew up in a neighborhood full of kids. A lot of them were my age. I had no problem ever walking outside my front door and finding a friend to play with. I enjoyed a lot of sports. I played baseball, soccer, and basketball. I was also in Boy Scouts. And then as I got older, I started to get into music, and I was lucky enough to have parents that were cool enough to let me have my band's practice at my house, and that was a lot of fun.
Okay, okay. So, do you want to go into like a little bit more detail about like how you were raised or anything like that?
I was raised, let me see, my mom and dad were pretty lenient with me. I had a few basic chores I had to do, which I was pretty responsible about taking care of. There was a pretty firm understanding that I needed to get good grades, and other than that, I was pretty free to do what I wanted to. And I didn't realize that that wasn't how everybody had it, but that's how I had it, and I think it helped me. And I think it helped me become responsible and pretty mature at a pretty reasonably young age.
Okay, okay. So, do you want to talk about your father at all, and how he was as a father and how he raised you?
My dad, growing up, my dad was a pretty interesting guy, still is. Uh, he is really smart at mechanical things. He's the kind of person that just never gives up on what he's trying to do. And he came to Kentucky from Washington, D.C., where, as a typewriter repairman, he kept making suggestions into the company's suggestion box. And after he had made several hundred of those, they realized that maybe they should offer him a job as an inventor or as an engineer because most of his ideas were really good. And that's pretty good for a guy who only graduated high school to be transformed into an engineer, especially at that time when everybody had to have a college degree. And it was kind of like a hard barrier for people to get past. But he got past it and earned his way up the ranks. And it was fun growing up with a dad who was an inventor. We built all kinds of crazy contraptions and would always try to fix things ourselves. And that was a lot of fun.
Okay. Um, so where exactly were you born?
I was born very near Washington, D.C., in a town called Rockville, Maryland. And I only lived there until I think first or second grade.
Okay. So, do you want to talk about your adolescence and go into a little bit detail of like your high school up to college time?
Okay, I recall very much enjoying middle school and high school. Um, in middle school, I was lucky enough to play on the basketball team, and I really enjoyed that. Um, and I started to form a group of friends. My situation was that my middle school kind of split. Half the kids went to one high school, the other half of the kids went to another high school. In this case, in Lexington, I was at Jesse Clark Middle School, and half my friends went to Lafayette while I went to Tate's Creek. It turned out that most of my friends actually went to Lafayette, and I missed them. And so high school was not that fun for me in the first year. But by some miracle, about halfway through my first year of high school, they rezoned the city, and I was rezoned to go to Lafayette. And so the next year of high school was a lot of fun because I got to get back with my friends, and it was much easier for me socially. I really enjoyed being in high school because that's where I started playing music and playing in bands, and that was a lot of fun.
Okay, so how has music changed your life?
Um, it's a good thing to have. It takes a lot of to understand music. I think is easy across all levels. So you can just listen to it. You can listen to it and think about it. You can listen to it and try to learn how to play it. You can learn instruments. The more you want to put into it, the more you'll get out of it. But what's nice is you can just simply start by listening. So for me, I found music to be something I could always do at any of those levels. I more and more got interested in guitar playing. And for me, at least back then, it was a bit tricky to figure out, how these great records were made and how those great guitar players were doing what they did. And so I rose to that challenge and put a lot of effort into figuring that out. I took guitar lessons. I tried to find other friends who could play and show me what they knew, and I would likewise show them what I knew, and that became a really fun hobby for me. So it mainly changed my life because it's what I spent my time doing, and can tell you many stories about times when I would stay up very late working on my music, or I would make choices to not go out with my friends because I would rather make music, and so it just shaped me into a guy who became pretty obsessed and would just try until I got something right. In this case, usually on guitar. But that's a habit that I later learned to apply to anything. So that was one of the probably the most important outcomes I learned from music is that that tenacity and that if you keep trying, you can usually figure something out.
Okay, so you played in some pretty successful bands throughout college. Can you talk about what that was like? Maybe tell like a funny or crazy story that happened in that time.
I played in a band called Rebel Without a Cause. That was one of the first popular bands I played in. They were already well established, and they were one of the more popular bands as I was getting out of high school and starting college. They were the type of band that was being hired to play almost every weekend somewhere, whether it was a music venue or a fraternity party or something like this. What was cool about them is that they had written a few original songs and they had actually put out a record. And they were getting ready to go on tour when their current guitar player decided he wasn't up for that. And so I replaced him. And our first tour was crazy. It was absolutely crazy. We every place we went, there was some kind of misunderstanding or snafu that you think you're going to be doing this big thing, and it turns out you're really playing between a couple cardboard boxes in the basement of a bookstore, and nobody's coming to the show, or they misunderstood the name of the band and they thought we represented the famous 50s movie called Rebel Without a Cause, and it was just nothing but, as they say, a Spinal Tap week. And we learned the hard way that being out alone by yourself, we had a whole lot of fun, but I don't think we made any money, and I don't think we played that much, despite showing up and being told, "Oh, sorry, we didn't know you were coming, so we booked somebody else," and we had a lot of those. But it was a lot of fun, and I am still to this day best friends with everybody in that band, and we still have a band 30 years later.
Okay, so are there any specific stories that kind of stick out that you might want to share?
What happened with that band was that we had a lot of fun, but we weren't that great at making original music, and we weren't that great at agreeing to what kind of music we wanted to make together. It really was four guys with four different ideas. And so what we did is very peacefully decided to split up so that each of us could pursue the sounds we wanted to pursue with different musicians. So out of that, I formed a band called 10 Foot Pole. John Herzog formed a band called Two Small Bodies. David Butler formed a band called Strangle Martin. And Scott Laney formed a band called Baby Blue. David Butler's band got signed to a big record deal, and they toured Europe and opened up for all kinds of great bands. John Herzog basically did the same thing. My band, 10 Foot Pole, was very successful with the amount of people that would come to our shows and how much money we would make because so many people would come to our shows. But we never really pursued a record label or anything like that. So we just spent our time touring around the various states around Kentucky. And, a lot of stories have to do with those surprises, playing fantastic shows or feeling like there's really no better feeling than what's happening right now on stage between a bunch of musicians that really get along really well. And what you learn from, going and performing and trying to entertain people on a Tuesday night in the middle of nowhere, or having a flat tire, which is going to make you late, and then you show up and they don't pay you, or going to a gig where the venue is actually closed down and they forgot to call you. Those always wind up being a lot of fun, believe it or not. And I think I learned a lot about how to be independent, how to work without a manager, how to work without a boss, how to work with three other people who you want to try to get along with, and there's a lot of stories that are kind of naughty, and I can't tell you this.
Okay. What was the music scene in Lexington like around that time?
The music scene in Lexington was at a peak in 1988 because that's right when WRFL first went on the air. And what led to that radio station was a lot of people who were very, very passionate about what we called alternative music. And what we meant by that back then was the kind of music that you had to go buy at a record store and play at your house because nowhere else would play that music. No radio, no internet, no YouTube, none of that existed. So the only way you could hear these artists was to go and buy the record and play it yourself. If you were lucky, you could have friends that would do it. Now, what we all would do is we would play our records into cassette recorders, and we would make what we called mixtapes. And a mixtape was your favorite song from several records, and that's really where that term came from. And this was the way that music would spread. And there was a lot of people who were crazy about music doing that in Lexington. Those people went on to form the radio station, and that radio station literally opened up the eyes and the minds and the ears of the Lexington music crowd. It was an overnight phenomenon where once that radio station went on the air, suddenly people were going out and seeing bands, and they were craving bands that played different music, not the stuff that was on the radio, not the greatest hits. And it was a wonderful time to be in bands that played creative, original music. And that was from 1988 until probably 10 years later. The buzz pretty much didn't stop. And most of it had to do with the radio station and the excitement that the radio station generated in the city.
Okay, so this is kind of off topic, and I asked you about this a couple days ago. What are three main like events that took place in your life, like kind of like nationwide, that kind of like everyone else experiences as well?
Thinking back on big events, I remember when I was in college, when the space shuttle was launching, we actually had a television in the engineering, what we called the engineering lounge. It was sort of the middle of a quadrangle, an indoor quadrangle area where kids would study. And we had the TV on, and we were going to watch the Challenger shuttle take off. And that's the one that was, there was a flaw. They said there was a problem with the O-rings. There were these rubber rings that acted as a gasket between the fuel line. And later they analyzed that was the flaw. But what we saw is this rocket go up in the air on the TV set as we all kind of stood around. The space shuttle had done this several times prior, and in every case it was fascinating and fun, especially for engineering kids to watch. And what was horrible about that historic event is that was a space shuttle that as it went up, it completely exploded, and instantly killed everybody, and it was just a very stunning feeling, especially for a room full of young engineers, to stand there and just the quietness that we all had to sit through as we were trying to absorb what possibly had gone wrong and how horrible the impact to human life was. And that happened when I was in college in the mid 80s. Another one that I remember pretty well is when I was in 11th grade and I was a big music fan. I remember when a kid came back from the dentist, and because none of us had internet or cell phones or anything, but one kid had come back from the dentist and said, "Hey, when I was driving back from the dentist, they said on the radio that John Lennon has been killed." And that was a weird one because although I wasn't a huge Beatles fan at the time, it was just kind of, I felt like that was a huge historic event. The big joke back when we were that age was that whether or not the Beatles would get back together. Would the Beatles play another concert? Would they maybe show up on Saturday Night Live and do one song? And it was kind of a joke they would make on Saturday Night Live. They would literally dangle a check and say, "Here's the check. We'll pay the Beatles if they'll just come and play one song." And, when John Lennon was killed, you realize that's never going to happen. And so that was pretty intense. And of course, the final one I think that people from my age will tell you is that on September 11th, 2001, we witnessed a great terrorist event in our country with the planes that hit the towers and the Pentagon. And what was crazy about that is that I remember leaving the house and hearing on the radio, which was playing, that what they said was a small plane has crashed into the towers, and they didn't make any fuss about it being a big deal. In fact, initially they said it's not a big deal. And then I was leaving and I went to work and they were still talking about it. And then when I got to work, we had an open lab, and in that open lab, we all were standing around just like back when I was in college with the Challenger explosion. And we were standing around the TV, and at that point they started to say, maybe it wasn't a small aircraft, maybe it was an airliner. And the facts were slowly rolling in when we, with our own eyes, witnessed the second plane hit the second tower. And, it was all unfolding in front of our eyes. So many questions we didn't understand. And then we heard that another plane had been down and another plane had hit the Pentagon. And that's when we all realized, that we were under attack. And at that moment, you don't know how much it's going to keep going. You don't know if the next plane's going to hit the building you're in. You don't know if they're going to start hitting all the cities. We literally looked up to see how many planes were in the sky. We didn't know if they all were going to start crashing. It was such a freaky and bizarre feeling. And the scariest part of all was that your grandfather, my father-in-law, worked in the Pentagon. We knew he was there. We knew that was where his job was. And we all were in complete fear that he had been hurt. And the hardest thing I had to do was call home and talk to my wife and say, "I'm sorry to inform you that we're under a terrorist attack, and one of the targets is the Pentagon, and we need to make an effort to see if your father's okay." And it turned out he was okay. He was very close to where the plane crashed, but he was okay. And he got out of there without a problem. So those would be the big three historic events that I would think back on. If I thought harder, I might think of three different ones, but those are the first three that come to mind.
Okay. Again, this is kind of off topic, but I'm gonna bring it back to the music scene to kind of tie it back to our current generation. So how do you think the local Lexington music scene has changed from the '80s, where you said it was a peak, to now?
Well, I like it. I think there's a lot of good music, and there's a lot of artists doing things that are exciting and unique. For me, it's always been about either being moved because something is intense or thought provoking, and that's all still there. The difference is that music is so accessible and so free and easy to get. It's overwhelming, with streamed music. I can know what you're listening while you're listening to it. I can check out what you're listening. I can do the same for any number of people. These social networks build up, and before you know it, everybody knows about everybody. So when I harken back to what was so hard for us in the mid 80s to actually find music that we might like, it took an effort. It took an effort to go and buy a record, take a risk because you thought it looked cool or maybe you heard about the band, and then go home and listen to it. There was nothing instant to that. And what I like about the local live music scene is it's exactly the same as that. I really don't know what these bands are going to sound like unless I go make an effort to see them. And hopefully they'll kick my butt. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But it's always worth the risk, and it takes some time. And it reminds me of that effort that it used to take with records. And there's great local venues in Lexington, and there's a lot of great local bands. Now many of them do have their music online, and they are pretty accessible, but we are so lucky to have so many talented musicians that we can just go and be in a room with. It's different than it was. The sounds have changed, the type of music has changed, and but all of it's great. There's so many great local bands and musicians, and I can't wait to go out when I do go see bands. It's something I enjoy, and it's always worth the effort for me. So the music sounds different, but the adventure is the same.
Okay, so I think we're gonna bring this to an end. Thank you for listening. I've been Jack Quinn, and my father,
Is also Jack Quinn's father,
and his name is.
Jack Quinn's dad.
All right.